A heavy mist clung to the weathered gravestones of St. Michael's Church as mourners filtered through its ancient wooden doors. The small village of Millbrook hadn't seen such a gathering since the previous winter's harvest festival, though today's occasion carried none of that event's warmth. Hannah Morrison's funeral drew everyone from the baker, who'd supplied her daily bread, to the schoolchildren she'd tutored in mathematics over the years. The church's stone walls seemed to absorb the morning's gray light, casting long shadows across the worn pews where villagers sat in somber reflection. Their hushed whispers echoed against stained glass windows that had witnessed countless services, though few as charged with unspoken tension as this one. At the front of the church, Hannah's wooden casket rested on a raised platform, surrounded by white lilies that did little to mask the underlying scent of aged wood and stone. Father Miguel stood before the altar, his usually commanding presence somehow diminished today, his fingers fidgeting with the edges of his prayer book as he prepared to begin the service. Among the mourners, David Turner sat in the back row, his status as a newcomer to Millbrook making him feel like an outsider at this intimate gathering. He'd only known Hannah for the 3 months since he'd moved to the village to escape London's suffocating pace, but her kindness had left an indelible mark. She'd been the first to welcome him, arriving at his cottage with freshly baked scones and a wealth of local knowledge that helped ease his transition into village life. As Father Miguel cleared his throat to begin the service, a movement near the casket caught David's attention. Duke, Hannah's faithful German shepherd, padded silently across the stone floor and settled himself beside the casket. The dog's presence wasn't entirely unexpected. Hannah and Duke had been inseparable for years, but something about his demeanor sent a ripple of unease through the congregation. Duke sat perfectly still, his posture alert and rigid, eyes fixed unwaveringly on Father Miguel. There was something unsettling about the intensity of the dog's gaze, something that spoke of more than mere animal grief. David noticed several villagers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their attention divided between the priest's words and Duke's unwavering stare. Mrs. Pembroke, the village librarian who sat 2 rows ahead of David, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something that made them both glance nervously at the dog. The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, creating an undercurrent of tension that seemed at odds with the solemnity of the occasion. Father Miguel's voice wavered slightly as he began the service, his usual confident tone replaced by something more hesitant. "We gather here today to remember Hannah Morrison, a beloved member of our community," he began, his words seeming to stick in his throat as Duke's gaze bore into him. David found himself studying the priest's face, noting the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the church's cool interior. Father Miguel's hands trembled as he turned the pages of his prayer book, his eyes darting everywhere except toward Duke and the casket. The service continued, but the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Duke remained motionless, his eyes never leaving the priest, while Father Miguel became visibly more agitated. He stumbled over familiar prayers, his voice cracking at odd moments, and his face grew increasingly pale. David's investigative instincts, honed during his years as a journalist in London, began to stir. He'd left that life behind, or so he'd thought, but something about this scene triggered his professional curiosity. The dynamic between the priest and the dog seemed charged with meaning, like a conversation taking place on a frequency only they could hear. As the service progressed, David found himself paying less attention to the words being spoken, and more to the subtle interactions playing out before him. He noticed how Father Miguel would occasionally start to turn toward the casket, only to stop himself, as if afraid of what he might see. The priest's collar seemed to grow tighter around his neck, and he repeatedly reached up to adjust it, his fingers leaving damp marks on the white fabric. The villagers, too, seemed to pick up on the underlying tension. The usual rhythmic responses to the priest's prayers became uncertain, scattered, as more and more attention focused on the strange tableau at the front of the church. Duke's unwavering vigil had transformed what should have been a solemn farewell into something else entirely, something that felt more like an accusation. Sarah Collins, who ran the village shop, caught David's eye and raised her eyebrows questioningly. She had been Hannah's closest friend, and David could see his own confusion and unease reflected in her expression. There was more to Hannah's death than a simple heart attack, her face seemed to say, and somehow Duke knew it. As the service drew to a close, Father Miguel's composure continued to deteriorate. His final blessing came out as barely more than a whisper, and as soon as the last amen had been uttered, he practically fled from the altar, his usual measured pace replaced by hurried steps that echoed sharply against the stone floor. Duke's head turned to follow the priest's retreat, his eyes never leaving Father Miguel's back until he disappeared through the vestry door. Only then did the dog's posture relax slightly, though he remained seated beside his mistress's casket, a silent guardian. The congregation began to stir, gathering coats and handbags, but the usual post-service chatter was subdued, replaced by meaningful glances and whispered conversations. David remained in his seat, watching as people filed past him toward the exit, many of them casting worried looks back at Duke. Sarah Collins paused beside his pew. "There's something not right about all this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Hannah was fine last week. We had tea on Tuesday, and she trailed off, glancing around nervously before continuing. She seemed worried about something, but she wouldn't tell me what it was." David nodded slowly, his mind already beginning to piece together the fragments of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until now. As the church emptied, he remained seated, watching Duke maintain his vigil beside the casket. The dog's behavior had transformed what should have been a simple funeral into something far more complex. A mystery whose first chapter had just begun to unfold in this ancient village church. The late afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the empty pews. David stood finally, his footsteps echoing in the near-empty church as he approached the front. Duke's ears twitched at his approach, but the dog's attention remained fixed on the vestry door through which Father Miguel had disappeared. "What do you know, boy?" David whispered, crouching down beside the dog. "What did you see?" Duke turned to look at him then, and in those deep brown eyes, David saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Intelligence, certainly, but also something that looked remarkably like purpose. The dog knew something, and somehow, David felt certain that uncovering that knowledge would lead him down a path he hadn't expected to travel when he'd sought refuge in this seemingly peaceful village. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the church windows, David made a silent promise. To Hannah, to Duke, and to himself. He would discover the truth behind the strange events of this funeral, no matter where that investigation might lead. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Outside, the mist had begun to thicken into evening fog, shrouding the churchyard in mystery. As David left the church, Duke fell in. Stepped beside him, their shadows merging in the growing darkness. Behind them, the church stood silent, its ancient stones holding on to secrets that were already beginning to unravel. The fog swirled around David's ankles as he and Duke made their way down the church path, the weathered gravestones looming like silent sentinels in the gathering gloom. Each step crunched softly on the gravel, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the questions pounding in David's mind. Duke padded beside him, no longer the tense, accusatory figure from the church, but still alert, his ears twitching at every sound that emerged from the misty evening. The village high street lay ahead, its Victorian lampposts casting pools of warm light that barely penetrated the thickening fog. The usual evening bustle had been subdued by the day's events, with only a few shadowy figures hurrying between the shops that were preparing to close. Through the dimmed windows of the Crown and Anchor pub, David could see clusters of villagers gathered in earnest conversation, their gestures animated despite their lowered voices. Sarah Collins emerged from the shadows of her shop doorway as they approached, pulling her cardigan tight against the evening chill. "David," she called softly, her eyes darting up and down the street before settling on Duke. "I've been waiting for you. There's something you need to know about Hannah." Duke's ears pricked forward at Hannah's name, and he moved closer to Sarah, his tail giving a single, deliberate wag of recognition. David noticed how the dog positioned himself to keep both Sarah and the direction of the church in his field of vision, as if he was still maintaining his watch even here. "Come inside," Sarah urged, unlocking her shop door. The bell above tinkled softly as they entered the small village store, its shelves casting long shadows in the dim light from the street. Sarah led them past displays of local produce and household goods to a small office at the back, flicking on a desk lamp that created a warm pool of light in the gathering darkness. "Hannah came to see me last Tuesday," Sarah began, settling in her worn office chair while David took the visitor's seat. Duke sat between them, his attention now divided between Sarah's words and the shop's front door. She was agitated, more than I'd ever seen her. She kept saying she discovered something that would change everything in the village. But she was scared, David. I've known Hannah for 20 years, and I'd never seen her scared before. David leaned forward, his journalist's instincts humming. "Did she tell you what she'd discovered?" Sarah shook her head, brushing a strand of graying hair from her face. "No, but she mentioned the church. And Father Miguel. She said she needed to pray about what to do, but—" She paused, glancing at Duke before continuing. The way she said it didn't sound like she was seeking spiritual guidance. It sounded like she was going to confront him. Duke's low growl at the mention of Father Miguel's name sent a shiver through the small office. The dog's reaction seemed to confirm Sarah's suspicions, and David found himself reaching for the notebook he'd carried during his reporting days, only to remember he'd left that life behind in London. Or so he'd thought. "The thing is," Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower, "Hannah had been spending a lot of time at the church lately. Not during services, but in the afternoons when it's usually empty. She said she was doing the flower arrangements, but Hannah never showed any interest in flowers before. And then there were the papers." "Papers?" David prompted when Sarah fell silent. "Yes, I saw her one afternoon through the shop window. She was hurrying past, clutching a manila envelope to her chest like it contained the crown jewels. When she saw me watching, she almost jumped out of her skin. That was 3 days before." Sarah's voice trailed off, The implication hung heavy in the air. Duke suddenly stood, his attention fixed on the shop's front window. Through the foggy glass, they could see a figure hurrying past, collar turned up against the mist. Even in the poor light, David recognized Father Miguel's distinctive gait, though something about it seemed more hurried, less assured than usual. The dog's reaction was immediate and striking. His hackles rose, and a low, continuous growl emerged from his throat, different from his earlier warning sound. This was deeper, more primal. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and even David felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "He's been doing that a lot lately," whispered Sarah, watching Duke track the priest's movement past the window. "Ever since the week before Hannah, before it happened. Duke used to be such a friendly dog, especially with Father Miguel. Hannah would often send him with donations to the church, and he'd trot back with a note and usually a biscuit or two. But something changed." David watched as Duke's muscles remained tense long after Father Miguel had disappeared from view. The dog's behavior was more than just animal instinct. There was an intelligence behind it, a purpose that seemed almost human in its intensity. "Did anyone else notice this change in Duke's behavior?" David asked, his mind already constructing a timeline of events. Sarah nodded slowly. "Mrs. Pembroke mentioned it to me last week. She saw Duke actually bark at Father Miguel outside the library. Said she'd never seen anything like it. Duke standing there, tail straight out, barking like he was trying to warn everyone about something. Hannah had to practically drag him away." The shop's old clock chimed 8, making them both jump. Outside, the fog had thickened further, turning the street lamps into distant, glowing orbs. Duke had returned to his sentinel position between them, but his attention remained fixed on the direction Father Miguel had taken. "There's something else," Sarah said, reaching into her desk drawer. "Hannah left this with me last Wednesday. Said if anything happened to her, I should give it to someone who could see the truth. I thought she was being dramatic at the time, but now—" She pulled out a small brass key, its surface dull with age. "She wouldn't tell me what it opened, just made me promise to keep it safe." David took the key, turning it over in his hands. It was old, possibly Victorian, the kind that might open a desk drawer or a small box. Duke's eyes followed the key's movement, and David could have sworn the dog nodded slightly, as if in approval. "The question is," David mused, studying the key's worn teeth, "what was Hannah trying to protect? And who was she protecting it from?" The answer seemed to hover just out of reach, like the shapes in the fog outside. But as David pocketed the key and prepared to leave Sarah's shop, he felt certain of one thing. Duke's behavior at the funeral hadn't been simple animal grief. The dog was trying to tell them something, and somehow, that small brass key was part of the message. Sarah locked the shop behind them, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the key. "Be careful, David," she whispered. Whatever Hannah discovered, it was enough to frighten her. And Hannah Morrison wasn't easily frightened. As David and Duke made their way through the fog-shrouded village, their footsteps echoing on the empty street, he could feel the weight of the key in his pocket like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Ahead, the church spire loomed through the mist, its cross barely visible against the night sky. Duke walked closer to David's side, his presence both protective and purposeful. The mystery that had begun in the church that morning was deepening with every step they took. In the space of a day, David had gone from being an observer at a funeral to being drawn into something far more complex. And somehow, he knew that Duke, this extraordinary dog with his unwavering gaze and apparent understanding, would be key to unraveling it all. The village settled into its nighttime quiet, but beneath that peaceful surface, secrets were beginning to stir. As David and Duke disappeared into the fog, the church bells tolled 9 times, the sound muffled and distant, like a warning from another time. The night ahead promised to be long, and somewhere in the darkness, truth and danger waited to be discovered. The moonlight occasionally broke through the thick fog, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance around them as they walked. Duke's ears remained alert, catching sounds that human ears couldn't detect, while David's mind raced with possibilities. The small brass key felt heavier with each step, as if the weight of its secrets was growing in his pocket. What had Hannah discovered in those quiet afternoon visits to the church? What had transformed Duke from a friendly companion into a vigilant accuser? And most importantly, what role had Father Miguel played in it all? The questions multiplied like the shadows in the fog, each one leading to another, deeper mystery. As they approached David's cottage at the edge of the village, Duke suddenly stopped, his head turning sharply toward the church. Through the fog, a faint light could be seen moving behind the stained glass windows. Someone was in the church at this late hour. Duke's low growl confirmed what David was already thinking. Their investigation couldn't wait until morning. The time for answers had come. The night was far from over, and the next chapter of their investigation was about to begin. The fog continued to swirl around them, nature's own curtain drawing back to reveal the next act in this unfolding mystery. David patted his pocket, feeling the outline of the key, while Duke stood ready beside him. Together, they faced the direction of the church, knowing that somewhere in its ancient walls lay the truth they sought.